All right, feminism question here. So, yeah, again, I'm kind of like getting you like right into a specific thing here about these arguments against like analytic philosophy as it stands, we might say. So let me just step back for a second and think about the kind of broader way to approach this and kind of what I'm really asking you to do by doing these things, kind of a more general thing I'm hoping to see happen. And that's important to have an idea of. So yeah, well, so I mean, there's the basic idea that of gender bias in general. This is probably more familiar when we talk about issues of ethics and social justice, like more concrete, practical philosophy, and that there's paternalism that's been at work since like forever. Well, maybe not forever. Maybe there was kind of a maternalist period of human history. There are some historical suggestions that there was a time and place where society was kind of gender biased, reflecting the female gender rather than male gender, and that's all pretty interesting. But it's kind of undeniable that social structures, social power, has been wielded by men, and that the institutions of society have been created by men, and that generally, inevitably is going to reflect a, how do you want to put this? Well, a bias, a preference, a inclination towards, structures that favor, as well as just blatant inequality and oppression and wrongdoings that are kind of systematic and ongoing, not just an individual's decision on an individual day, but built into the system, right? So, all of that's familiar enough, I think, at some level, whether you agree or disagree, in the realm of ethics and political philosophy and daily life, family structures, religion as well, my gosh. Um, Question: is there a similar kind of gender bias complaint to be raised in epistemology, as might have a natural home in ethics? So a similar relevant kind of thing in epistemology. I mean, just to make it a meaningful question to ask, like not an obvious yes, at least the case needs to be made. There are certainly pretensions within epistemology, and I would even say um, in ways that might not even make sense in ethics or political philosophy, to be truly objective in ways that, I mean, in ethics, maybe you just can't have the kind of factual objectivity we can in epistemology, because ethics doesn't concern facts in ways that epistemology does, because there's just no such thing as ethical facts. That's a very common view, actually, in contemporary philosophy. Um, so maybe there's a kind of objectivity that we can have in epistemology that obviates any need for a distinctively feminist or degendered methodology or approach, because it's sufficiently objective and degendered already. And maybe there's even an explanation that we could give for why epistemology would be unique in this way, because maybe there's this kind of objective, factual basis in epistemology that ethics and political philosophy and other more normative domains don't allow for, precisely because they're normative. Maybe think back now to um, Moore's um, naturalistic fallacy, if you're familiar with that. Um, so that's interesting as a maybe one reason to think that epistemology can make a special case for itself of not needing, or let's say this, for being immune to gender bias. And maybe you could kind of respond to the initial feminist worry with an initial response of that sort. So maybe now it's a little pushback to the view saying we really wouldn't need an independent feminist epistemology because we've got like superhero objective analytic epistemology and don't need it. Um, Maybe especially on the heels of Zagzebski and virtue epistemology, which is not decidedly feminist, but it has been developed by a good percentage of women in the field, or a good percentage of the people that have developed virtue epistemology have been women. There is a interesting kind of internal, I guess you could call them demographics, with gender demographics within um, virtue epistemology, because there's different versions of it, but certainly it has attracted that style of thinking, let's say, that seems to give expression to emotions and feelings and motivations and intentions in a brand new way within epistemology. Um, so, what we might say back against this idea that epistemology is kind of magically objective is that, unlike these other normative areas of philosophy, like ethics and political philosophy, so this is how this relates to the point here about virtue epistemology, and that one thing we've seen from virtue epistemology, but just in general, is that epistemology is just as normative as these other fields like ethics and political philosophy, specifically like ethics, because all of the major epistemic paradigms, like internalism and externalism and virtue epistemology, presuppose basically one or other of the fundamental normative structures that ethics employs. And that's fundamental to being able to make what we would call epistemic evaluations. That's what a judgment of being justified is, or that a person has knowledge, or that they don't. We're making epistemic evaluations here. And when we do that, we're using the very same normative frameworks that ethicists use when they make evaluations about good and bad conduct. So epistemology is normative, and thus it might not have magical objectivity in ways that these other areas of philosophy also don't, right? So, okay, maybe now we really have to kind of like make a defense in the particular case here. Look at the details. We're not going to just get it by these kind of first moves. So that's when we get into the prompt. There's a lot of pretext here, but I'm trying to just give you a way that you can kind of like situate the very specific things that I jump right into asking you about here in the prompt. Because, I feel like part of my job is to make sure that you're connected to the reading, because I need to be seeing that you're demonstrating knowledge of the reading, not just knowledge in general, knowledge of our reading. So that's how we start our prompt. So, as I might say, with that being said, let's look at the actual prompt. Explain at least 2 reasons that analytic philosophy has been viewed as containing a gender bias by feminist epistemologists. And thus, we say there have been calls for an independent feminist epistemology as arising from that need for one, the need being demonstrated by the gender bias that this thing called analytic philosophy clearly contains. So there's a ton to be said about what analytic philosophy is, but go to the Antony essay there. I think she kind of nicely characterizes what this thing called analytic philosophy is. I guess I consider myself an advocate of that general approach to philosophy. I think I consider myself generally convinced by her view that there's pockets, there's avenues within analytic philosophy to do feminist philosophy. but there have certainly been calls and arguments that it doesn't. And I have to say, those are fairly convincing too. So here, get out two of the reasons that people have been led to call for a need for an independent feminist epistemology because of the specific character of analytic philosophy. So there's those routes, there are those kind of arguments right there, many of them in the Antony paper, and they're kind of strewn throughout in a way, but they're bunched at the beginning of her paper. So she uses that as the kind of pretext to make her own argument. So here I want you to, just explain what that's all about. What are these feminist calls against analytic philosophy because of its gender bias that we really need now a independent feminist epistemology that isn't necessarily to fully replace analytic philosophy. I mean, you might say that, but it's at least to sit alongside it, right? So that we're hearing both voices. Okay, because I guess the worry is that we've really hidden or subtly, maybe not so hidden, who knows, in the advocacy of the primary epistemic virtues in analytic epistemology of neutrality and objectivity. Really, that's a male voice speaking to us. At least the way that neutrality and objectivity have been defined, maybe we can put it that way, are ways that have a characteristically male voice, So I have to say it's pretty believable. The question is, well, what kind of bias does that introduce? So then the feminist epistemologists actually, I think, do a pretty good job of following through on saying like, well, here's how this is actually kind of biasing, is this kind of objectivity, or this notion of objectivity still really leaves room for these specific kinds of gender bias. So the more detailed you can kind of make that, of kind of connecting those points, the better. All of this is still within kind of describing the worry raised by feminist epistemologists. Ultimately, now let's kind of move on. Antony is going to reject this because, essentially, like, I think we can say that analytic philosophy is heterogeneous enough that when you look at it correctly, there's lots of internal criticisms of it. In particular, these notions of objectivity and neutrality as kind of like, give me a break, they're not these magical notions that you think they are. And one of those voices has been Quine, who in many ways I think exhibits the characteristically male persona, but for, I think, other reasons, not concerns for kind of gender balance in the voice that is philosophy, ends up presenting internal criticisms of analytic philosophy as it stood at the time. And not only that, but I think mechanisms for developing philosophical perspectives within analytic philosophy kind of like reformed, that really, I think, enable the female voice on these matters to be heard. At least that's going to be, Antony's general argument. And she notes a few specific points of Quine's. And here I think you should be able to demonstrate a knowledge of those, even if you're not going to make those the central focus of your paper because, I don't know, something else is going to be. I think what counts as demonstrating knowledge of our readings relevant to this prompt includes demonstrating some understanding of Quinean holism, which makes a long discussion of that, and his argument against the analytic-synthetic distinction. So that, and I think those were like the two main things of Quineanism, because most of the other stuff follows from that. Included here also is like the Davidsonian radical interpreter. If you remember that from the Davidson paper, Davidson was a student of Quine's. Um, so here you want to be doing this. Once you transition from describing the initial feminist arguments against analytic philosophy to now still basically expositing, describing, explaining um, Antony's counter argument, what you need to be doing is making sure that you're correctly explaining these Quinean views that enable her to make this counter argument, and exactly how it is that these Quinean views work as a counter argument. How does that suitably enable the feminine voice to be heard? So I think Antony needs to be showing that, and that means that you need to be showing that, even if you disagree with it. Like, what's her thinking about, in some detailed way, like Quantian underdetermination and holism allow for um, the feminine voice. So, okay, so you got that. Now I'm kind of like pushing the ball back to you. It's been in your court the whole time because you're needing to kind of set up a systematic way of going through these ideas that are leading you to now be, all things considered, having gone through this analysis, argue for or against the claim that analytic philosophy contains a gender bias, which must be remedied by a distinct feminist epistemology. So here the ball's in your court, it's your argument to make. What matters here is that you're making an argument and that this is supported, the argument you're making here, by the previous analysis that you've been giving all along the way of these feminist arguments against analytic philosophy, Antony's rebuttal to those feminist arguments against analytic epistemology, and where this now leads you to think about the main issue, which really is whether or not there's a need for this independent feminist epistemology to remedy the ills of philosophy as it stands, or at least analytic philosophy as it stands, specifically epistemology done in the analytic tradition, which is more or less what we've been doing. That's what we've been doing. So that puts us in a pretty interesting way to reflect back on the class. Does all this stuff represent too much of a male perspective? At least in a way that a fully adequate philosophy would have to contain a female gendered voice to balance out the overly male perspective that the whole thing has been based on or has kind of been coming from. So maybe not, as I noted in class, all of the second half readings have been from female authors, and they haven't been overtly feminist pieces, as you can tell. We're just kind of getting into it now, but they have been written by women, and interesting to reflect on whether there's a decided difference that you see in the second half stuff from the first half stuff. And yeah, maybe that's just a difference because it's a different topic, but is there a different way that those topics have been pursued that seems to reflect a more distinctively feminine voice? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. If there isn't, then we might wonder. If it seems like these essays could have been written by a man or a woman, I don't know. What does that show? Maybe that shows that it doesn't really matter who's writing philosophy. It doesn't seem gendered if we can't tell the difference between a female and male author as readers. Maybe that's like a Turing test or something like that for whether we need it. But there's a response to that. It could be that either there's a kind of like unconscious buy-in that women authors, I don't want to say suffer from, but kind of in a way, really, that they're kind of victim to, having been born and raised and living under a patriarchal system. It can seep in a way. I mean, that's kind of like the aim of the patriarchy, is to get people, in particular women, to buy into it. So maybe that's what we're seeing in seeing that if you do think that the female authored pieces in our readings can't really be obviously distinguished from the male authored pieces, maybe that's the reason. Maybe the patriarchy has succeeded. you know. On the other hand, what if it might be that it's a sufficiently degendered inquiry that the product doesn't look or sound gendered because the process sufficiently takes care of that. Maybe it's a good thing um, for epistemology generally, and the kind of more optimistic view of it, that already it's trying to weed out bias with these ideas of objectivity and neutrality, and maybe those aren't gendered bias conceptions of objectivity that are being used. So who knows? I think there's a lot of room to kind of just reflect on that. And here I would just kind of like to see you make an argument. I myself feel kind of pulled in a few different directions, but I think it's interesting to let yourself be pulled in those directions. That, in a way, speaks to the value of going through this topic and thinking these through, whichever side you fall on. I think it's good for people to do. Having your mind stretched in new ways is a good thing. Alrighty, so I hope you enjoy.